We pulled 4 generations of Mustang GT into the shop, all with over 150,000 miles on the clock, and tore into every one of them looking for the truth about which engine actually holds up. I've been turning wrenches on these cars for over 20 years, and I've rebuilt more Mustang V8s than I can count. Going into this, I had a pretty good idea which engine would win. I was wrong. The generation everyone assumes is the toughest, the one with the most power and the most modern engineering, showed a wear pattern the older engines never had. Meanwhile, an engine most enthusiasts consider outdated just kept running like it didn't get the memo that it's supposed to be falling apart by now. Let's get into what we actually found under the valve covers. We started with the oldest car in the lineup, a 2006 Mustang GT with the 4.6-liter 3-valve V8 sitting at 168,000 miles. This engine gets a bad reputation, mostly because of one specific problem that scared away an entire generation of buyers. The 3-valve heads use a 2-piece spark plug design, and when those plugs seize in the aluminum threads, which happens more often than Ford ever admitted, the top half snaps off during removal, leaving the electrode and porcelain stuck in the head. I've personally dealt with this on probably 30 different 4.6 3-valve engines over the years, and it's a real problem, but it's a maintenance problem, not a design failure that kills the engine. The owner of this particular car, a guy named Terrence who bought it used in 2011, had already been through 2 broken plugs by the time it hit 90,000 miles. He learned the hard way to have a shop pull the plugs while the engine is still warm, never cold, because thermal contraction is what causes the aluminum to grip the plug threads and shear them off. Once we got past the plugs, the internals told a different story than I expected. The timing chain guides, which are made of a nylon-coated material that's known to wear and eventually snap on these engines past 150,000 miles, were still intact, though they showed noticeable wear grooves. We measured chain stretch, and it was right at the edge of specification, meaning this engine had maybe another 20,000 to 30,000 miles before that chain set needed replacing. The cam followers, which are notorious for oil starvation issues that cause them to seize against the cam lobes, were clean and showed even wear. Terrence had been fanatical about oil changes every 4,000 miles with full synthetic, and it showed. Compression across all 8 cylinders came back within 8 psi of each other, which is excellent for an engine this age. The bottom line on the 4.6 3-valve is that it will absolutely get you past 200,000 miles, but only if you stay ahead of the timing chain guides and cam follower wear, because when those fail, they don't fail gently. They take out cam lobes and sometimes valves with them. While we had the front cover off, we also checked the intake manifold, since coolant leaks around the manifold gaskets are another well-known weak point on this engine as the plastic components age and shrink. Terrence's manifold had already been replaced once at 130,000 miles after he noticed a slow coolant loss and a faint sweet smell in the cabin, a classic symptom of a leaking intake gasket allowing coolant to seep past the seal. The replacement manifold was holding fine with no signs of a repeat leak. We also pulled the oil pump housing to check the aluminum backplate, since extended high RPM use can cause it to flex slightly and drop oil pressure at the top end. Terrence's driving habits were mostly conservative commuting, so the backplate showed no measurable flex, and oil pressure held steady even at higher RPM on our dyno pull. For an engine that gets written off by a lot of buyers who've only heard the spark plug horror stories, this 4.6 3-valve proved that with the right owner and the right maintenance habits, it's a genuinely durable piece of engineering. Next up was a 2013 Mustang GT with the first generation Coyote 5.0 sitting at 179,000 miles, owned by a woman named Priscilla who used the car as a daily driver and occasional track day toy. This is where things started getting interesting. The Gen 1 Coyote, built from 2011 to 2014, uses cast iron cylinder liners pressed into the aluminum block, a much simpler and more forgiving design than what came later. When we pulled the pan and dropped the oil, there was no sludge, no metallic sheen, nothing that suggested internal wear beyond normal. We pulled a valve cover to inspect the cam phasers, which use oil pressure to adjust intake and exhaust timing and are a known wear point across every Coyote generation. The phaser solenoids were original and still within spec for response time when we tested them with our scan tool. Priscilla had done 2 track days a year for the past 6 years, which means this engine had seen sustained high RPM runs, sometimes bouncing off the 7,000 RPM redline repeatedly during a session. That kind of use is exactly what kills weaker engines, and this one didn't care. We bore-scoped all 8 cylinders, and the iron liners showed a healthy crosshatch pattern still visible, meaning the factory honing marks that help the rings seal and retain oil film hadn't been worn smooth. Compression was excellent, within 5 psi across all cylinders. If I'm being honest, this was the engine I expected to be the strongest going in, and it delivered. The Gen 1 Coyote earned its reputation as the toughest version of this engine for a reason. Simpler oiling system, simpler cylinder wall design, and a forged crankshaft that Ford way overbuilt for the power levels these engines actually produce from the factory. We also pulled Priscilla's transmission fluid for inspection since her car came with the 6-speed manual, and even after 6 years of track use, the synchros showed normal wear with no grinding on any gear, and the clutch, though a second replacement unit installed at 95,000 miles, still had roughly 40% of its friction material remaining. The one minor issue we found was a slightly worn passenger side motor mount, likely from the repeated hard launches at the track, which had allowed just enough extra engine movement to cause a faint rattle at idle that Priscilla had mentioned but never worried about. It's a $150 part in a 2-hour job, nothing close to a real engine concern. Everything else on this car, from the throttle body to the oil pan gasket, looked like it belonged on a car with half the mileage. The third car was a 2016 Mustang GT with the Gen 2 Coyote at 161,000 miles, owned by a mechanic friend of mine named Dale, who bought it specifically because he wanted a Coyote with the Gen 2 airflow and compression improvements, but before Ford moved to the more complex direct injection system. Gen 2, built from 2015 to 2017, bumped compression up and improved the intake and exhaust ports for better breathing, but it kept the same basic iron liner cylinder architecture as Gen 1. Dale's car had been babied, regular oil changes, no track use, mostly highway commuting. What we found was almost identical to the Gen 1 car. Cylinder walls looked great under the bore scope, compression was tight across the board, and the only real wear item was a slightly loose secondary timing chain tensioner that was still within Ford's specifications, but on the softer side of acceptable. Dale had noticed a faint cold start rattle for the last 15,000 miles, which lines up exactly with a slightly worn tensioner losing a bit of its hydraulic pressure before oil pressure builds. This is a known and well-documented issue on higher mileage Coyotes, and it's not something that typically causes catastrophic failure if you catch it during a routine service. Between Generation 1 and Generation 2, we genuinely couldn't find a meaningful durability difference at this mileage. Both held up the way you'd want a 5.0-liter naturally aspirated V8 to hold up. Dale's car had the 10-speed automatic transmission, which came online partway through Generation 2 production and replaced the older 6-speed automatic. That transmission gets a lot of criticism online for harsh shifting complaints, but at 161,000 miles, we found no unusual wear on the valve body, no metal contamination in the fluid, and shift quality on our test drive was smooth through every gear. Dale mentioned the transmission did have a firmer than expected downshift under hard braking when the car was newer, but a software update from the dealership a few years back had smoothed that behavior out considerably. The rear differential, a Torsen limited slip on his car, also checked out fine, with fluid that still smelled correct and no metal flakes on the drain plug magnet. Then we got to the car that changed my expectations for this entire test. A 2019 Mustang GT with the Gen 3 Coyote at 154,000 miles, owned by a guy named Marcus who'd had the car since new and kept meticulous service records. Gen 3, which started in 2018, is the most powerful naturally aspirated version of this engine Ford has ever put in a Mustang GT, and it introduced direct injection alongside the existing port injection system, along with a redesigned cylinder wall. Instead of pressed-in iron liners, Ford switched to a plasma-transferred wire arc coating sprayed directly onto the aluminum bore. It's lighter, it allows tighter bore tolerances, and on paper it should be at least as durable as the old iron liner setup. Marcus had mentioned a light engine tick before we even pulled the car in, the kind of tick a lot of Coyote owners have learned to just live with because it's so common across all 3 generations and usually harmless. But when we bore-scoped this engine, we found something none of the older cars showed. Light but visible scoring on 2 of the 8-cylinder walls, specifically cylinders 4 and 7, consistent with what's known in the Coyote community as piston slap against a coated bore that developed uneven clearance. This isn't universal to every Gen 3 engine, and Marcus's car was still running fine, still making full power, still passing compression within reasonable spec at 6 psi variants. But it's a wear pattern the Generation 1 and Generation 2 engines simply didn't show at similar or even higher mileage. Marcus had been diligent with his maintenance too, synthetic oil every 5,000 miles, no track abuse, mostly weekend driving, with a normal commute mixed in, which rules out owner neglect as the explanation. That's actually what makes this finding more concerning rather than less. If a well-maintained, gently driven example is showing early scoring at 154,000 miles, it points toward a manufacturing or design factor rather than a driving habit factor. And that's a much harder problem to prevent as an owner, since there's no maintenance interval that fixes a coating inconsistency baked in from the factory. The working theory in the independent shop community, and one that lines up with what we found on Marcus's engine, is that the plasma-coated liner can develop microscopic inconsistencies during the spraying process that create slightly uneven clearance in a handful of cylinders. Over tens of thousands of miles, that clearance allows the piston skirt to lightly contact the cylinder wall on each stroke instead of riding purely on the oil film, and that contact slowly chips away at the coating. Unlike an iron liner, which can tolerate a huge amount of wear before it becomes a problem, a damaged plasma coating doesn't really get better. And in some documented cases, it's led to owners needing a full engine replacement because the coating can't be rehoned or repaired like a traditional liner. So here's the part that genuinely surprised me. The newest, most powerful, most technologically advanced engine in this test, the one that should have been the clear winner on paper, was the only one showing a form of wear the older engines are essentially immune to. That doesn't mean the Generation 3 Coyote is a bad engine. Most of them will run well past 150,000 miles without ever showing this issue, and Marcus's car is still driving around perfectly healthy today. But if you're looking at reliability specifically, the data doesn't support the assumption that newer automatically means tougher. If you're finding this useful, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because next week we're pulling apart the Generation 3 cylinder coating issue in a lot more depth, including which build years show it most often and what oil weight actually matters for protecting those cylinder walls. We also wanted to include the current Generation 4 Coyote in the S650 Mustang, but I have to be straight with you here. The oldest S650 GTs are only a couple years old at this point, and none of them have anywhere close to 150,000 miles yet, so we simply do not have real-world data at that mileage to responsibly include in a test like this. Anyone telling you they've already found long-term reliability patterns on a Generation 4 Coyote at 6-figure mileage is guessing, not reporting, and I'm not going to do that to you. What I can tell you is that Ford refined the direct injection system again for Generation 4 and made further changes to how the cylinder coating is applied, specifically aimed at improving consistency after the Generation 3 issues became more widely known in the industry. Whether that fully resolves what we found on Marcus's car remains to be seen, and we'll be tracking it as these cars accumulate real mileage. So what does all this actually mean if you're shopping for a used Mustang GT right now? If long-term durability is your only priority and you're not worried about chasing the most horsepower, the Generation 1 and Generation 2 Coyotes from 2011 to 2017 are proving to be the sweet spot. Simple, forgiving, iron-lined engines with a track record of running well past 200,000 miles when maintained properly, and none of the cylinder coating concerns we're seeing pop up on later cars. The 4.63 valve from 2005 to 2010 can absolutely go the distance too, but you need to be religious about warm plug removal and timing chain guide inspections, because those two failure points are well documented and predictable. The Generation 3 Coyote from 2018 to 2023 is still a fantastic engine, more powerful and more efficient than anything that came before it. But if you're buying one used, get a bore scope inspection done before you hand over any money, especially if the seller mentions a persistent tick that's never been diagnosed. It's a small check that can save you from a 5-figure engine replacement down the road. And if you're eyeing a brand new generation 4SS 650, you're essentially betting on Ford having learned from the Generation 3 experience, which historically they usually do, but there's simply no substitute for real mileage and real time on the road to prove it out. What surprised me most putting this test together wasn't any single failure. It was how much the story runs opposite to what most people assume about engine evolution. We're conditioned to think newer means better in every measurable way, more power, more efficiency, more refinement, and usually that holds true. But durability doesn't always move in a straight line with technology. Sometimes the simpler, older design that's had over a decade to prove itself in the real world is still the safer bet than the newest engineering marvel that hasn't had time to reveal its weak points yet. That's not a knock on Ford's engineers, who are dealing with emissions regulations and efficiency targets that simply didn't exist when the Ironliner Coyote was designed. It's just a reminder that on paper specs and real-world 150,000-mile durability are two different conversations, and as a shop, we care a lot more about the second one. I've had customers ask me over the years whether they should hold out for the newest Coyote generation when shopping for a used Mustang GT, assuming that newer automatically means safer from a reliability standpoint. Based on what we found tearing into these 4 cars, I'd actually push back on that assumption. A well-documented, well-understood engine with over a decade of real-world data behind it, like the Gen 1 or Gen 2 Coyote, gives you something the newest engineering simply can't offer yet, which is certainty. You know exactly what to watch for, you know exactly when parts typically wear, and the entire independent shop community has years of collective experience diagnosing and fixing anything that comes up. With the Gen 3, and especially with the still unproven Gen 4, you're relying on Ford having gotten it right the first time, and our test suggests that with the Gen 3 cylinder coating, that wasn't entirely the case for every engine that left the factory. If you're sitting on a Coyote-powered Mustang right now, whether it's a Gen 1, Gen 2, or Gen 3, the single best thing you can do for long-term reliability is stay on top of your oil changes with a quality synthetic. Pay attention to any cold start ticking that gets progressively louder rather than staying consistent. And if you own a 2018 or newer car, don't ignore that tick the way a lot of owners have learned to. Get it checked with a bore scope at your next service instead of assuming it's just a Coyote thing. Catching early cylinder wall wear before it turns into piston slap damage is the difference between a routine inspection and a rebuild. Next week, we're going deeper on that exact topic, breaking down the Gen 3 coating issue cylinder by cylinder with data from a lot more cars than just Marcus's. If you want to see that when it drops, make sure you're subscribed and the bell is turned on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.